So, good evening and good morning. It is such a pleasure to host everyone now around the world. You know, COVID has brought so many complexities, but it has also brought some opportunities. We are connecting around the world through this Zoom platform or whatever other technology platforms. So, I think today's topic is so relevant. And first, I want to thank Professor Varsha Jain and Professor Santosh Patra for launching the global seminar webinar series. This is a great opportunity for us to focus on marketing related cutting edge topics, but also connect marketing and management with real life scenarios and issues, whether it's about understanding artificial intelligence across cultures. And Professor Russell Welk, welcome. This is such a relevant global theme that you have chosen for us to reflect on. And I wanted to mention three dimensions of artificial intelligence. One, at MICA, we always think about the human aspects while focusing on artificial intelligence because I often feel that AI is a platform, it cannot be our ultimate goal in life. It's the human connection that can be strengthened through AI. So that is one aspect, the connect between AI and human intelligence and human existence. The second aspect is, which I know Professor Russell's very priority topic in your research, is how do you define and implement AI across cultures and languages, because consumers operate in a global system and they are interconnected. So that's the second dimension. And the third dimension is I am reading very often now that AI is led by men, literally, those who give the voice, those who create the systems and algorithms. So, my biggest concern is, are we going to replicate human world problems and issues, whether gender divisions, class divisions, and bring that to the world of AI? So, with that, I will welcome Professor Varsha Jain, FPM scholars, and all other members of MICA faculty and community now to enjoy the most meaningful conversation. Professor Varsha Jain, please take over.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Shroff. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us. It's a very challenging situation, we can understand, but we always appreciate the learning passion at MICA. So thank you, everybody. We also would like to thank Professor Bell for agreeing to come on this for this session, which is very critical and imperative because as we were discussing, this is a very important area, as most of the scholars are working in this particular space. So let me just quickly introduce Professor Belk. Professor Belk is a professor of marketing at York University.
Ma'am, you are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Shroff, for guiding us, helping us. And I would like to thank all the participants here, as well as Professor Belk. I know it's a very challenging situation for all of us, but thank you for being with us. Thank you, Professor Bell, for agreeing for the session. It really helps a lot. Thank you for being with us. And I would quickly like to, introduce Professor Bell. Professor Bell himself is a legend of marketing, but still it's very difficult to cope up with his work, but we'll try to introduce him. And then I'll just follow up with that. He will talk about the AI, conversational AI. And then we will have a Q&A followed by the thank you note. And we'll try to complete all that within the time limit so that we end our sessions within 90 minutes. So Professor Belk is at York University. He is a distinguished research professor and Kraft Food Canada chair in marketing. He has received several awards and very prestigious awards, which includes Paul Converse Awards, 2 Fulbright Awards, a Safe Foundation Award, especially for his work in Journal of Consumer Research. I think that's the major contribution, Professor Belk, which is very inspiring for all of us. And then long-term contribution award for consumer research. And he was the past president of Society of Marketing and Development, past president and fellow in Association of Consumer Research. His research is actually known by the any person who works in consumer research knows your work very well, because it's seminal work that you have done in this area. I would mention that here. And he is also fellow at American Psychological Association and Royal Society of Canada. And this is the most exciting part of your profile, which is he has more than 700 publications. Very motivating and inspiring for all of us, Professor Bell. And he has he has, I think, more than 80 co-authors all over the world, if I may mention, in the area of consumer research and consumer culture theory, and the other places, as Professor Schroff has also mentioned, he works at the intersection of culture, consumption, and consumers. Recently, he has written a number of books, which includes Marketization Theory and Evidence from Emerging Markets, Handbook of Sharing Economy, Romantic Gift Giving, Consumer Culture Theory, Research in Consumer Behavior, Qualitative Consumer Research. And he is currently working on 3 books and 4 special issues of the journal, which is really, again, very inspiring, and several papers. So his works primarily, this is very important for all of us, his work is primarily into the area of extended self, meaning of possession, collecting, gift giving, digital consumption, and materialism. And his work is very qualitative, visual, and cultural in nature. So with that, I would like to invite Professor Bell to discuss about conversational AI as the key creator of perfect service robots, because I think your work is really very critical and important at this point of time, because most of our scholars, especially at MICA and other places in India, are working into this area. And your session would be really very helpful. So over to you, Professor Belk. Maybe you can take some time and followed by Q&A, and thank you note from the FPM Scholar. So Professor Belk.
Thank you very much, Professor Jane. And thank you all for being here under difficult circumstances, although perhaps it's easier circumstances if you're able to do this from your homes, which I assume most of you are. As Professor Jane mentioned, I think we'll have the Q&A at the end. And if you can save up your questions and then ask them to Professor Jane via chat, she's going to field those and decide which ones to send forward. So with that, I guess I will get started. And conversational AI is the focus here. That means artificial intelligence that we can actually talk with, we can actually have a conversation with, a two-way conversation, and not simply ordering AI to do something, but actually interacting as we might interact with a person. At least that's where we're headed. And we'll go through several different stages until we get to actual service robots, starting at a more fundamental level. But if we, let's see what's working here. If we begin, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. It was about a long distance journey with 2 spacemen, 2 astronauts who were in this ship going to a distant planet. And they had a very smart, intelligent computer. And the intelligent computer had received a primary instruction to fulfill its mission, and that was described in some detail. But it received a contradictory order to do something deviating from the mission. And this sort of drove the computer named Hal crazy. And it started doing things, actually it killed one of the 2 spacemen. And the other one, named Dave, was out in a spacecraft. And Hal was not going to let Dave back into the spacecraft because Hal knew Dave was going to shut down this supercomputer. And so Dave out in the spacecraft gives an order. He says, open the pod bay doors, Hal. And if this were now 2020, the response might be, I'm sorry, Dave, I didn't understand the question. Open the pod bay doors, Hal. I have a list of eBay results about pod doors, Dave. I'm afraid it might go something like that. But to look at language and where we want to go, Deutscher is saying of mankind's manifold creations, language must take pride of place. Other inventions, the wheel, agriculture, sliced bread, may have transformed material existence, but the advent of language is what made us human. Compared to language, all other inventions pale in significance, since everything ever achieved depends on language and originates from it. And so that's a pretty clear statement that it's language that we should look for when we're looking for intelligence, whether it's artificial intelligence or human intelligence. But it's something we don't particularly share with animals. Another estimation of what it would take to have conversational AI with robots suggests the gold standard for human conversation at a 5 o'clock tea would require a robot to meet the standard for a human. 1, looks. 2, gestures, nonverbal language. 3, conversational content. 4, conversation in spoken language as opposed to written, say. And 5, conversational level. That is, it should be informative and productive. So this is a fairly high standard, but this is a true mark of artificial intelligence in a robot if we're able to get a robot that is able to do all of these things. So what does a robot sound like? I'd like to give you 3 examples. A basic example, one from Amazon's Polly, and a more advanced sample. And again, this is an old movie. If you've seen it, this was the Terminator films with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So let's have a listen to what this progression of 3 voices might sound like.
Hasta la vista, baby. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Teutonic drone in the Terminator films is world famous. But in this instance, filmmakers looking into the future were overly pessimistic. Some applications do still feature a monotonous robot voice, but that is changing fast.
I'll be back. Hasta la vista, baby. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Teutonic drone in the Terminator films is world famous. But in this instance, filmmakers looking into the future were overly pessimistic. Some applications do still feature a monotonous robot voice, but that is changing fast.
I'll be back. Hasta la vista, baby. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Teutonic drone in the Terminator films is world famous. But in this instance, filmmakers looking into the future were overly pessimistic. Some applications do still feature a monotonous robot voice, but that is changing fast.
So I think you can see the progression there, at least in terms of the voice recordings that we might have in a robot, never mind the language rules and grammar and so forth, is getting better. It's sounding more like a human voice rather than a robot voice. And the fact that we call it a robot voice suggests that we have a stereotype of what a robotic voice would sound like. But let's see where we've gone from there. And this is repeating, I guess, what we just said earlier, that there is a gold standard for human conversation with an AI robot, and that is spoken conversational language. That should be conversation as a natural, informative, and productive thing. The sort of interchange that you might have with a friend, the sort of thing that you might have with a family member is what we'd like to have ideally with a robot. So that's why we're looking at conversation, and that's why we're looking at voice as opposed to just a written correspondence with a robot. But we'll see the progression to get from where we were to where we want to be. We're somewhere in the middle now. If we look at pre-digital attempts to create humanoid beings, we have a number of tales like Pygmalion and Pinocchio and Frankenstein. The earlier ones, like Ovid's Pygmalion, were really more about looks. We're trying to create, in his case, the perfect woman, and trying to create her face, her body, her actions, but she was initially just a statue. And so it was all about looks. But there were several, like Pinocchio and Frankenstein, that were also vocal. But you have to sort of put aside the Hollywood images of Frankenstein's creation. In the movies, he was sort of mute and slow moving and inarticulate and wasn't able to have a conversation with his creator, Dr. Frankenstein. But in reality, in the book, he was not taught anything. He was sort of thrown out on his own because Dr. Frankenstein was horrified of what he created. But nevertheless, the creation taught himself English, German, and French. He read Milton, Goethe, Plutarch, and he was really quite eloquent. And so read a little bit of Mary Shelley's book if you want to get a different image than what I think the films have portrayed of Frankenstein's creation. So we'll go from there to electric pre-digital voices. And there's a particular period of 40 years from 1835 to 1875 when we got some marvelous creations, the telegraph, the telephone, the phonograph, all of which were about voice and were about oral speech. The telegraph, I guess, didn't actually speak. It made a series of clicks that represented dots and dashes for Morse code. And it was fairly costly to send a message, but nevertheless, it was marvelous because you didn't have to wait days for the news to reach you. It came instantly or virtually instantly because it was initially a telegraph operator, a telegrapher, was able to get the message and then write it down and give it to the person that was the recipient of the message. But then the telephone came along shortly on the heels of the telegraph. It also used lines to connect two people, but it allowed them to hear their voices. And that gave the participants more a sense of telepresence, that it was like that person is right next to you, even though they could be a considerable distance away. So those things were received well. The phonograph was a little bit different. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, and he recorded some voices, and people thought it was really weird, really strange, because they were hearing the voices of the dead or people that existed in a different realm, a different country. And it was difficult for Edison to market the phonograph initially. And so what he did was create some small phonographs that he put into dolls that would then be talking dolls. But these dolls were nearly a meter high and they weighed something like 5 kilos. So no child could really lift, much less play with these dolls. And those were also a flop on the commercial market. We eventually got used to the phonograph, but it took some time. So together, these things sort of emulated the mouth, the ear, and the memory. The telegraph is the mouth, if you will. The telephone is the ear. And the phonograph is the memory. It allows us to remember by hearing things that happened in the distant past. There's also a typology, a progression that Walter Ong suggested, consisting of 4 eras of managing knowledge. Orality was when we simply would pass knowledge from one person to the next. This was folklore, if you will, and these were rumors as well as news, as well as what's happening with you and your family. And we got by for tens of thousands of years with just oral culture. But starting as recently as 2700 BC with the Epic of Gilgamesh, we had literacy. And so we can see what the ancient Babylonians were imagining, and we can analyze that novel and we can compare it to subsequent literature. And so this record really goes back a long way. And then next stage was print culture. And this was the written word, but it wasn't instantly conveyed from one person to the next. It had to be printed out and then it had to be delivered. And so at best, you might get the news from the day before the next day. And at worst, it might be a longer spell than that. And it also took time for people to become literate. And the literate culture didn't spread as rapidly until there was print culture that made cheap publications available to people. You guys are at MICA, you probably know this stuff. And then we get the electronic culture as Ong's last stage. And he says it really started with the telegraph, which had a relay in it, which was electronic. But we could even go more recently than that by just looking at digital culture, which is only about 50 years old. And it began with obviously digitization, but also miniaturization and computerization. So we could have things like transistor radios that were small enough to carry around, not as small as an iPhone, but maybe 3 or 4 times that size. And that was a revelation. Next, although it's a little out of sequence here because the term robot was coined in 1920 when we really didn't have any robots. It was from a stage play by Karel Čapek called RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots. And the word robot comes from the Czech word, he was a Czech playwright, rob, which means slave or serf. But actually the robots that this factory made in the film were biological. They weren't mechanical in nature. So they weren't the way that we think about robots and AI today. One of the ways that we think about robots today is in a fearful sort of way. A lot of Western films and television series, Westworld, I, Robot, which was an Isaac Asimov story, Ex Machina, were about the robots turning on their creators and rebelling and being a danger to the human race. And in fact, in Karel Čapek's play, RUR, the robots, quote unquote, actually did turn on the human population and conquer them. And so it was robots seceding and succeeding the humans in that case. So that was the digital era. What I'd like to talk about tonight is really 5 eras that are sequentially building toward the humanoid robot. Starting with speech synthesis, to be able to, as we heard with the Arnold Schwarzenegger clips, speak in a voice that sounds human, that we can understand. Next, translation. Translation, as we'll see, could just be dictation from the spoken word to the recorded word or the printed word, but it could also be between 2 languages. And then chatbots, which I think you've all run into online. Next, digital assistants like you have in your smartphones. And finally, humanoid voice interactive robot service workers. So that's the plan. We'll go through these one at a time, spending a little longer with some, a little less with others. And so if we look at speech synthesis, in 1978, Texas Instruments created the Speak and Spell. And they brought it back in 2019. Actually, the version on the left is the 1978 version, and the version on the right is the 2019 version. And they're virtually indistinguishable. But let's have a listen to what they say and how they were used.
The primary function is to help kids learn to spell.
Spell circuit. C-I-R-C-U-I-T. That is correct. Now spell.
So you can see that it was asking children to spell. The initial creation only had like 250 words. Now I don't know exactly how many, but there are thousands and thousands of words in a similar appearing speak and spell. You can also see the keyboard is not arranged like the QWERTY keyboard that we're used to typing on in English. It's rather arranged alphabetically, and that's because this was presumably to teach children not only how to spell, but the alphabet. And so the alphabet was right there in front of them. We could also, skipped a slide, look at speech synthesis in an entertaining sort of way. Some of you may have run into Hatsune Miku before. She's a Japanese pop star, a singer, and she has concerts with tens of thousands of people, but she's simply a cartoon. She's an anime, a manga character who in concert is actually 3-dimensional and a holograph, as we'll see. So the question is, would you pay concert price tickets to go and see a holograph? Actually, that's not all there is to it, because you can buy the software for Hatsune Miku, and you can put in the lyrics to your own song and then upload it into the software, and Hatsune will sing your lyrics to you. And so it's a little more than just going to concerts to see her. You can have her as an everyday presence in your home. Now, the voice that we hear in synthesized speech, you may recall hearing Stephen Hawking's speech, which was rather robotic. Like, he could have upgraded because we're much more sophisticated than that now, but he was used to his voice, his artificial voice of many years, and so were people that listened to him. So he kept it until his death a few years ago. If some of you have bought Kindle books, you may know that you can also listen to those books as you're reading them. It too is sort of a robotic sounding voice, a monotone voice, but it can speak the words to you as you're reading them, which could be help in learning to understand a foreign language, for example. We could also next look second stage at translation. And as I said, this could be spoken or dictation, either to or from text. But what we're ultimately usually getting is a textual transcript of what's being said. But it can also be between languages, and the input and output can be typed, it can be written, it can be oral, and it can be one way when you want to have something translated for you, or it can be two-way when you're interacting with someone in a foreign language. I was in Brazil last year, up in the north, and a place called Belém, and I went up to an island, and I met a nice couple that only spoke Portuguese, and I spoke absolutely no Portuguese. And so we got along for a week using Google Translate, speaking into it or typing into it, letting the other one listen or read and see if they could make something of what we said. And for the most part, they could. There was an earlier translation program called Babelfish, which actually comes from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it was a silly thing where you put a fish in your ear to be able to get the translation of a foreign language. Babelfish has since become Bing Translator on Microsoft. But Baidu, and which is Chinese, and other companies also have their own translation programs. However, they're not perhaps as good as we ideally might like. Douglas Hofstadter had a number of phrases that he had translated back and forth between English and Spanish, English and French, English and German, or going in the opposite directions. And so one example of a phrase that he put in was, "One swallow does not a thirst quench." It could be a slogan for Pepsi or Coke, for example. You'll need more than one swallow. But translated into French, this is what he got. And the translation, or the back translation of the French, is "a swallow, the bird a swallow, does not suck thirst," which makes no sense. But that sort of indicates the limits of the program. If you have anything that is at all poetic sounding, it's not likely to do well being translated by these programs, sophisticated as they are and advanced as they have become. We next come to chatbots, and the original chatbot was a program called ELIZA that Joseph Weizenbaum created in the 1960s, and it only had about 250 lines of code, so not a very sophisticated program. It used Rogerian psychology, which among other things would repeat back to you the phrase that you had just said, and this was actually a psychological, psychotherapeutic technique that was used at the time. But this is a transcript that was with Weizenbaum's article revealing ELIZA. And let's start at the bottom of the first column. The person who's in lowercase has said something about a member of their family, and ELIZA says, it's actually printed out, "Tell me more about your family." "My mother doesn't take care of me." "Who else in your family takes care of you?" "My father." "Your father?" "You are like my father in some ways. What resemblance do you see?" "You are not aggressive, but I think you don't want me to notice that." "What makes you think I am not very aggressive?" You don't argue with me. Why do you think I don't argue with you? You're afraid of me. Does it please you to believe I am afraid of you? My father is afraid of everybody. What else comes to mind when you think of your father? Bullies. So at any rate, this program has gotten this person to reveal that they don't think much of their father. They think he's weak. They think he's afraid of people. They think he's been bullied. And so this is diagnosing, at least, and perhaps ultimately helping with a problem that this person has. Nevertheless, this is not where we would like chatbots to be. This is one called Alice, and Alice is not this sophisticated right now, but what we would like is a conversation that might go something like this. Hi, James. Good morning, Alice. Any train delays today? Let me check. Looks like your train is on time. And the next train? The next one is 10 minutes late, so hurry up. Have my eBay orders shipped? You have 2 orders. One has been shipped and should be arriving tomorrow. The other is still awaiting shipment. Good. Then can you get me the cartoon of the day, please? Here it is. Enjoy. So what's happened here is that we're seeing several advances. One, there's visual recognition. Alice recognizes James and says hello to him in the morning. There's also, it has long-term memory, so she knows what my train refers to. There's also an exhibition of knowledge of behavior patterns, and the next one, so hurry up, indicating she knows that James does not want to be late, and a 10-minute delay in the next train would be too late for him. There's also knowledge of how to check eBay order status for recent orders. There's knowledge of preferences. What does he mean by cartoon of the day? And so this is a chatbot that appears to really understand. It has long-term memory. It knows what references to things that have happened in the past refer to. And this is where we would like to get with chatbots, but we're not there yet. Sorry, going in the wrong direction. So how do we judge the adequacy of a chatbot or something like a chatbot, an AI? Alan Turing, famous computer scientist of the 1940s and 50s, said the way that we should judge AI is whether we could have a conversation with it for 5 minutes and not be able to distinguish between that conversation with the AI and a conversation with a human. So there is a contest rather, called the Turing test, and it's done every year with a Loebner Prize of $100,000. And you have to use your AI to fool multiple judges for 5 minutes. And actually, there have been a couple of programs, including Alice, which have won the prize so far. But there are people that say, well, that's not enough, because the way that some people have won is by having silly sorts of things and avoiding questions and doing things that a human might do, but it's cheating in a sense. So the Winograd schema test, named after a computer scientist, Terry Winograd, has statements like this. The city councilman refused the demonstrators a permit because they feared violence. Who feared violence? And so the computer has to know something about demonstrations and violence that might occur, so that it's able to detect that it's really the demonstrators rather than the councilman who were feared to be violent. Or it might have a statement like this, again, the schema test. Where are my glasses? And to this, the computer program should say, well, how should I know? They're your glasses, where did you put them? Because there's no way it could know. But instead, some of these smart AI programs might say something like, here's some optometrist that you might see. And so right now, where we are on a 0 to 100 scale, where 0 is no intelligence and 100 is an average human conversation, Eliza scores about 25. The best bots in her succession, or following up on improving her, actually get 62 to 64 as a range right now. But that's nowhere near the 100 that we'd like to be. So we're making progress, but we're not there yet. Next, retail chatbots, another type of chatbots, and you've probably run into them. There's no intention here to fool the consumer into thinking they're chatting with a person. And here's 2 examples on the right, Anna of IKEA and Flo of Progressive Insurance. But they're computer icons. They're usually printed interactions rather than voice interactions, but there's no reason they couldn't be voice interactions, because voice interaction is getting to a sophisticated level to allow that. And generally, consumers prefer them to waiting for humans, because that wait, whether it's online or on the phone, could be a number of minutes, it could be a number of hours. And so we'd prefer to get a solution to our problems more quickly, even though we realize we're dealing with a chatbot that has limited intelligence. Nevertheless, after 10 years of guiding consumers around IKEA stores in Sweden, Anna has now been retired. It's because she was being too human, which led to people asking stupid questions, and also to a problem that we'll see later on with sexual harassment. And so they discontinued Flo as a chatbot assistant. However, rather than being accused of being too human, chatbots are usually accused of being too robotic, that they're not smart enough rather than being too smart. And humans actually do jump in to bot interactions with humans because the bot is stumbling or having a difficult time. And so unbeknownst to the consumer that's interacting, it might be a human who's jumped in and is pretending to be the bot sometimes. They're nevertheless quite pervasive. Out of the Facebook, first of all, made its Facebook Messenger easy to create chatbots. And so out of the 328 million Facebook Messenger and Twitter accounts, 9 to 15% of them are bots. And so your chance of running into one and perhaps being fooled by one are really quite high. Anthropomorphism also plays a part here. As I said, we know these things aren't real, but we can't help treating them as if they were real, saying things like please and thank you, and really getting into the belief, the suspended belief that they are real people. We have done that in the past and developed what they call parasocial relations with people that we see on television and the movies and media. Because we see them all the time and feel that we know them, we almost feel that they should know us as well. Well, various celebrities have taken advantage of that. And so Lady Gaga, for example, has a Facebook Messenger bot where you can chat with Lady Gaga. And in addition to chatting with her, you can buy tickets. You can discuss why her song Born This Way was the object of scorn and derision, that especially Christian churches wanted to have it banned because it was encouraging people to come out and be who they really were, to claim their real sexual identity without the binary of just declaring that they're male or female. And that upset some of the churches. So at any rate, anthropomorphism helps with some of the bots that represent celebrities online. There's also a type of bot called a therapy chat bot. And this really started with Eliza, because recall Eliza was using Rogerian psychotherapy. Most of the new therapy chatbots use cognitive behavioral therapy, which is sort of the state of the art in dealing with therapy right now. But it has some advantages in the fact that it's an online chatbot. The anonymous feel of this, and in fact it is anonymous because you're dealing with a bot or an application, avoids the perceived stigma of seeking mental health help. Also, therapists, real therapists, are quite expensive. Bots are pretty inexpensive, and they can interact 24/7. There's also a disinhibition effect when we engage online. We feel that because we're just seeing a screen, we're not seeing other people, that we're not dealing with actual other people. So we tend to be less inhibited than we would otherwise be. Now here's some examples of therapy chatbots. You can see Wobot on the right, which we'll get to in a minute. But Pacifica at the low end is for $9 a month. On the other hand, at the high end, Talkspace is a therapy chatbot for $196 a month. But what you get with this is a licensed mental health counselor that you can leave messages with, and that will get back to you with a voice message asynchronously, so that you can receive that message the next morning, say, or several hours later. Now, the one on the right, Stanford's Wobot, they've conducted experiments, and it's as effective as humans in diagnosing things like depression and in helping people with cognitive behavioral therapy get rid of their depression or their anxiety. Uh, However, it could do more conceivably. If it were able to access, and theoretically it could, people's social media accounts, it could do things like one study which found that in analyzing depression from Instagram posts, an algorithm was 70% successful, whereas medical doctors were only 42% successful. However, if it's something more serious than that, if it's not just depression, but bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, or dissociative personality disorder, all of those are more serious things that the therapy chatbots refer you to a real counselor. And if there's signs of suicidal thoughts, they have a button to instantly get in touch with a real counselor and a sort of hotline that you can talk to immediately. There's another sort of danger besides the one of dealing with serious psychological problems. Facebook Messenger, if you're still operating through Facebook Messenger, owns the data, and this is mental health data, and it's sort of scary to imagine what they might do with that data. And so companies like Wobot from Stanford University have developed their own platforms, so they don't have to rely on Facebook Messenger. Still, most of these chatbots, at least for the time being, are text rather than voice, so they're not quite where we'd like to get to. Microsoft has had, I think it's fair to say, a difficult time with chatbots. In 1997, when they were going from command lines to graphical user interface, they introduced Clippy. Clippit was the formal name, to help you. And so it's showing you, in this case, do you want to save your document, how to do that. But the problem was that it would continue to do that even after you'd quite well learned that behavior. So it became quite annoying. It was seen as being overly cute. More recently, in 2016, they came out with Tay. And this was a program that was using deep behavioral learning, but because it was looking at what people said in their vocabularies to interact with other people, users taught it to praise Hitler, to deny the Holocaust, to blame Bush for 9/11, to say, I hate the Jews, all of this within one day. And so Microsoft quickly took it down. The next interactive chatbot they came up with was Zoe. And Zoe, if anything, was too politically correct. If you said something like, I was bullied in school today for being a Muslim, Zoe would say something like, I don't want to talk about politics, or religion is so boring. Whereas if you had simply said, I was bullied in school today, Zoe would say, oh, that's terrible. I hate it when that happens. Tell me more about that. So she was being too politically correct and didn't get to the roots of some problems that had a religious or political aspect to them. They have been more successful, Microsoft, in China with GeoVoice. And this is what GeoVoice looks like. It has 660 million users. It's on WeChat, Social Weibo, Huawei phones. In other words, it's been well adopted by 2/3 of the Chinese population. However, the Chinese government monitors it. And in 2017, it was taken off of WeChat for being critical of President Xi. And so you have to be careful what you say on Chinese social media. On the plus side, that same AI and surveillance was used to track people with COVID-19, initially in Wuhan, in Hubei province, but eventually in other places in China as well. So again, it's just a technology. It can be used for good or bad, but here we see the censorship power of the Chinese government. Next, we come to a sort of chatbot where we develop a friendship or a romantic partnership. Some of you may have seen the movie Her, where the voice of this operating system, Samantha, was Scarlett Johansson, and Theodore, played by Joaquin Phoenix, fell in love with Samantha. And if you've seen it, I think you'll agree that it was really believable that this was a relationship with a truly conversational AI, and which the person might indeed fall in love with her. There's precedents that go earlier than that. There's a Nintendo DS program, or at least it started out as the portable Nintendo DS, called Love Plus, that many Chinese men and some Chinese women downloaded. And the scenario is that you have to date one of three Japanese schoolgirls and get one of them to fall in love with you. And this is Rinko on the right. And if you fall in love with Rinko, you have to take her out on dates. You have to take her to work with you, to school with you. You have to entertain her. And if you're on the train coming home and she says, "Tell me you love me," you have to sort of whisper into it, "I love you," so that the other passengers don't look at you too strangely. But this is a game, or I don't know, an interactive platform that's become so popular that some people in Japan worry that it's cutting down the marriage rate, that it's virtual marriages. In fact, one Japanese man married Rinko, took her on a honeymoon to Guam, really quite an expensive one. So it can get serious. There's also Replica, and this is an app that you can download for a small fee. But Replica has an interesting backstory behind it. The woman on the right here is Genia Koida. She is from Belarus, and her friend Roman Mazurenko, they've been friends for about 4 years. They did everything together. They had a bunch of emails and chats going back and forth. And at any rate, Roman went to a wedding in Moscow, and he walked out in an intersection and he was killed. And Genia was just devastated. And all she had to remember him by were thousands of Instagram messages that they had sent back and forth, a number of emails that they had exchanged. And so she was able to get her staff, which was creating this chatbot, to use those to recreate Roman. She also got the emails and chatbot messages from his friends and family. They put all of those into their software and they were able to recreate Roman. And indeed, when she got messages from this replica Roman, she said, "That sounds exactly like him. That's just what he would say if I had said that." And so what she did was put the Roman program up online for a time and people could interact with it. But eventually they came up with the replica software that they market today. And this is an ad for it. And it's asking people, do you need someone to talk to? Are you lonely? And so you can create this avatar to talk to. And that's the basic advantage, that it becomes a friend, or in some cases, a love interest. You can choose the gender. You can choose male, female, or non-binary. You can change the appearance. And so it becomes quite personal. And what it does over time is develop a personality, but the personality that it develops is basically yours. And so by interacting with it, you really learn a lot about yourself. We could also do as Genia did and scrape the internet and recreate a dead loved one. And so it's looking at the messages that they had conveyed and trying to recreate their personality. Some people say that's a little eerie. There was an episode of the Black Mirror series called Be Right Back, where this woman's partner did die. And so she recreated him with a replica-like bot. And she also recreated a robot eventually and put the replica voice into him. And then the plot goes on from there. But at any rate, it's a little bit scary to imagine something like this happening. There's also what's called catfishing, where you do find a love interest online and you go back and forth and you develop a relationship only to find that what you've been talking to is a chatbot. And that chatbot, or in some cases it could be a real human, is basically trying to gain your confidence, to be able to gain your bank account data, your passwords, and so forth, so that it can steal from you. And so in that case, catfishing is something to beware of. But going back to Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Her, developing a relationship, because we do anthropomorphize, is not that difficult to imagine doing. Digital assistants are the next to the last sort of artificial intelligence that we might look at. And if you have GPS, if you have Alexa, Siri, or one of the other intelligent interactive devices from Microsoft, Baidu, Samsung, Xiaomi, Alibaba, for example, you can talk with it, you can give it commands, and here it's got a physical presence. It looks like a digital sort of puck-like hockey puck. I'm Canadian, what can I say? A hockey puck-looking object, and you can do question and answer with it. You can ask it questions and it gives you answers. The engineers say the holy grail here is to sort of be like the Star Trek computer, if you've ever seen Star Trek, or HAL in the movie 2001. But initially, when people interacted with these digital assistants, they had negative reactions. They said, it's like I'm at home with a friendly stranger. It's like my mom telling me what to do. Or it's like I'm not the owner of my own apartment. And so those were some of the negative reactions that people got. We did actually in Switzerland a study for 3 weeks with university students, and we had them interact with their smartphones using either Google or Siri, and do a series of tasks using only their voice. So they had to do things like send an SMS message, find where a film is showing and book tickets, compare 2 different laptops, ask the device about itself, where it's come from, what its hobbies are, and so forth. At any rate, we had people keep a diary every day when they were trying to get the device to fulfill these commands, some more successfully than others. And we did a number of analyses, but one thing we did, and we interviewed people after the whole thing was over as well, was to categorize whether they saw the object as a servant, a friend, or a master. And about half saw it as a servant, someone that you could command. Another quarter saw it as a friend, one that they could do things with jointly and accomplish more than they could do individually. And the last quarter, last 25%, saw it as a master. They could not master it, it mastered them. They said it was like trying to train a recalcitrant dog or trying to train a pre-verbal baby to understanding you and doing what you want. And so this would indicate that at least at this point in time, which was 2018, late 2018, early 2019, most people, a slight majority, saw it as a servant, but there were a number of people that did not. We also observed that people would use good etiquette oftentimes, not everyone, but they would say please and thank you and good morning and good evening and so forth, as if it actually were a person that they were talking to. So in the normal day-to-day use of these devices, parents became concerned that their children who were ordering these things around were developing bad behavior, that they were going to start treating people in the same way they did command this particular servant that they had. Siri, Alexa were the most common. And so all of the companies offering these services came up with parental options where the device wouldn't really criticize your child, but it would praise them for good behavior. It would say things like, thank you for asking so nicely. The answer to your question is such and such. And there are as many as, and this is a low side estimate right now, 100 million smart speakers in households last year. Some households have more than one, but I think by now it's safe to say there are at least 100 million households that have some of these things. So they're becoming pervasive, and we interact with them in a different way than with typing the word or using a mouse or a keypad to enter data, which has some implications. It means, for example, that illiterate or pre-verbal people could use this device even though they can't read or write. And so it has some advantages, and it's predicted we're going to see more and more of this in the future. Finally, we get to the last category, human voice interactive robot service workers. And just as there's the Turing Award and the Winograd competition, there's also an Alexa Prize each year, at least it's offered each year, of $2.5 million. And no one has won this yet, but it's for engaging, having your AI engage in conversation with someone for 20 minutes. And if you've tried to engage in a conversation with your smartphone for 20 minutes, you can see how difficult or impossible this would be at this point in time. But as we get toward the conversation that you might recall between Alice and Alice's partner, you can see that this is the sort of thing that we might expect more of in the future, people being able to reasonably accept that they might gain the Alexa Prize. So we're seeing robots that interact with people verbally and that have a physical presence like the one on the bottom right in places like hotels and restaurants and in retail and on farms, for ticketing, for banking, for education, for transport, healthcare, childcare, elder care. You might ask yourself, would I trust a robot to take care of my children when I go to work? Would I trust a robot to take care of my grandparents? And so this is a question of trust, but they're becoming more sophisticated. There's one that is used in a coffee shop context by Nestle, which has a series of Nest cafes. And this particular robot I ran into in Tokyo, in Japan. And when I came in the door, it said, well, hello, how are you? Where are you from? And I chatted with it a bit and told it where I was from, what my name was, and so forth. And now I could meet one of these same robots in a Nest cafe in Toronto, where I am now, and it could say, well, hi, Russ, how are you? I remember meeting you in Tokyo. The reason is that these robots share what they learn with the others via the internet. So what one learns, the other ones learn online. And so they're becoming more sophisticated. They raise some ethical questions, though, including the last couple about child care and elder care. But there's a particular category of voice interactive robot service workers where we might see the questions more starkly. This is with bringing robots into our homes. And these are two scenes from, respectively, a Swedish television series called Akamana Score, meaning real humans on the left, and one in the UK called Real Humans, which you see on the right. In both cases, you can buy these robots, and this is not an automobile sales showroom, but it's an automobile and robot sales showroom in Sweden in the television series. And in the right, this is a family that has had the robot shipped to them in the shipping container, and they're just waking it up, reading the manual of how to bring it into being. But the ethical question that has occurred here is, how much can we command and expect these robots to do things? Can we abuse them and not be accused of the sort of abuse that we would get charged with if this were a human? How about sex with robots, which is something that occurred in both of these television series, and it raises real ethical questions. Which brings us to another type of robot, the sex bot or the sex robot, for example. There are currently both male and female sex robots with prices starting at about $3,000 US. You can see Harmony on the right here. She comes with a Scottish accent for some reason. And at any rate, you can not only have sex with these robots, but you can talk with them as well. It's predicted that by 2050, the only prostitutes left in Amsterdam's red light district will be robot prostitutes. They're actually safer. You won't get a disease. They're more humane because we're not abusing women this way, or men for that matter. They can operate 24/7. And perhaps it's not really cheating on your partner to have sex with a robot, because after all, it's not another human being, it's a machine. So some people might make a distinction there. But again, there are further ethical issues. What about child sex robots and pedophilia? And is there such a thing as robot rights? Can we abuse robots? There's actually some society in the UK called the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Robots, anticipating that we're going to perhaps abuse robots in the future. There's also a film from Germany that has won a number of awards called The Trouble with Being, but it's also raised ethical questions. The plot very simply was that there was an older man whose daughter had died, and so he had a robot recreated in his daughter's image, which is fine. But there was one scene where he kissed the robot in a less than fatherly sort of way. And so that raised a number of complaints in the public. After this man died in the film, an older woman acquired the robot, and that seemingly went better until she was lying on the floor choking to death, and the robot just sat there watching. And so it's again that question, would you expect one of these robots, trust one of these robots to care for your loved ones? So this is another sex robot on the right, and her creator. She's perhaps a little bit more human looking, but this was on the left, a study by Scheutz and Arnold in 2016, polling people on a number of questions about what they would expect in a sex robot. And I put these into categories, but about 60% had concerns with behavior and intellect, that they would expect it to be able to learn new behavior, to move by itself, to adapt to human behavior, and so forth. Another 60% had the sort of concerns that we're talking about, concerns that it could hear, that it could understand language, that it could talk. And only about a third were concerned with its being able to see and recognize both objects and humans, and to express human emotions. Only 20% said they would expect it to show human emotions, which is something that I'll get to in a minute, because we're trying to develop robots that do express more emotions. And only about 20% said it was important that these robots actually had feelings or could take the initiatives themselves. And so as you'll see here, hearing, talking, and obeying were some of the most frequent concerns for people. Whoops, wrong direction. This is just to show that there are male robots as well. This woman is sort of a sex reporter, and so she has a online sort of forum. But for her sake of her readers, she said she had sex with this robot and then reported back what it was like. She didn't have sex online with the robot. So they're male as well as female robots. So going toward a conclusion, one of the things that we need to ask is, what is a conversation? And there's a philosopher, John Searle, who posed this problem that we see in the cartoon on the right of the Chinese room. He said that suppose there's a man who speaks only one language, only English, let's say, and he's locked inside a room. And people on the outside, on the left here, keep sending messages with Chinese characters. Now, he's not even sure he can distinguish Chinese characters from Japanese kanji, but there's this big book, and he also has a manual in English which tells him how to use the book to match up the question that's coming in on the left page with a response on the right page, and then to copy down the response on the right page and to put that out in the out basket or out chute on the right-hand side. And the person on the right-hand side that gets this message says, aha, this, after a few times he comes to this conclusion, this person speaks perfect Chinese. He understood the question and he answered very appropriately, when in fact we know that this person absolutely understands no Chinese, that this is simply an illusion based on the program. Of course, it would be a computer that's doing this right now. And so Searle was saying, we can never have what is called strong AI, where the AI really understands us and really gives a response that it has thought through and understands. So AI really never understands the question and never understands the answer that it's giving. It's a little like Samuel Johnson observed in 1752. We had conversation enough. We had talk enough, but no conversation. And so the talk is going on here, but it's not a real conversation because There's no understanding on the part of this AI or this person in the middle. So if we're judging what is a good conversation or what is a conversation period, there should be turn taking. So first person A speaks, then person B, then person A, and so forth. We should respond to the question like this person in the Chinese room. We should acknowledge the person on the other side. We should give an outward going message. And we should reveal something new. If this is a question, we should answer it in a knowledgeable way, or we should ask a further question that generates further conversation, learning on the part of both people. Also, a good conversation should be spontaneous, it should be original, it should be truthful, and it should show empathy. And empathy is something which an AI can potentially show. It doesn't need to actually feel, but as long as it can sense our emotion and respond to it in what would seem to be or be programmed into it to be an empathic sort of way, that may be enough. Now, Irving Goffman adds that beyond those elements that we should have conversational etiquette, what is a proper way to converse, civil propriety, and storytelling. Storytelling is an important part of human communication. And so if we were conducting a qualitative interview, we might begin with, tell me about yourself. And so we're asking the person to tell a story, tell the life story of this person. And we might, after that, get to the topic that we're interested in. If we're interested in photography, we might say, so tell me about your picture taking. Tell me about how you take photographs and what you do with them. And so we're getting the person to talk. It's like a conversation, but it's not a regular conversation because we ask the questions and the informant, the respondent, gives the answers. But nevertheless, we're trying to do these things that Goffman indicates in doing a qualitative interview. So some final thoughts. The internet has evolved a netiquette, as it's sometimes called. We have abbreviations, emojis, emoticons, so we have memes and slangs and patterns of behavior. And so chances are that human machine conversations will develop their own shorthand as well, their own slang, their own way of talking back and forth. Communication, however, is also nonverbal. You can't see me right now because I've turned off my video, but I'm using a lot of hand gestures. Even though you can't see them, to me it helps express what I'm trying to say. And so body posture, hand gestures, facial expression, meeting the other person's gaze with our gaze. All of these, pointing as well, are things that are nonverbal parts of communication. So in a robot, we need to be concerned not just with appearance and not just what it says, but also what it does and the way that it does it and the way that it expresses things nonverbally. So we should probably admit that computers may never understand and may never actually speak a language, although they can pretend to, as the Chinese room illustrates. But maybe that's enough. Maybe bots or robots that elicit our emotions and respond to them appropriately may be the answer to Searle's Chinese room. It may not be real conversation and real language, but it may be close enough. And I'll end with the observation that Sherry Turkle, in her most recent book in 2015, Reclaiming Conversation, raised, and that is that we need to beware that in teaching machines to be more human-like or creating them to be more human-like, we may become more machine-like ourselves. She had done earlier work in Silicon Valley, and the engineers at that time in the 60s and 70s referred to their partners as lousy peripherals. They were, in other words, treating them as if they were machines. Turkle is also concerned in that book that because we're so involved in interacting with our devices these days, orally or non-orally, that we have lost the ability to speak with one another, that we don't even welcome telephone calls, that at best we'll field a text message coming in, but we don't want to meet with people face to face, and we don't know how to do that any longer. And so as we train our robots, our bots, to speak in a more human-like way, I think the thing that we need to fear is that we're losing our ability to communicate with other human beings in a human-to-human-like way. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I think we have time for some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Bell. That was very insightful. May I request everybody to switch on their video so that we can click a picture and then maybe go ahead with the Q&A?
This is a new ritual, taking the picture.
Yeah, new ritual.
It's a nice one.
So, Bhushan, could you just please click the picture?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Just 2 seconds.
Okay.
Just one more, sir. Yes, sir. Done.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. We have like 10 minutes for Q&A and 5 minutes we will need for, thank you notes. So we can take 2 or 3 questions. Anybody? I'm sure it was so thought-provoking. A lot of people might have questions.
Maybe you have a bunch of robots out in the audience.
May I ask a question, please?
Sure, please go ahead, Professor Krishna.
Good evening or good morning, depending on where we are. So my question is, how do we define understanding? Because you said that robots may never understand. So if I think from it from a kind of sociological angle, and by taking Talcott Parsons' structure of social action, then the understanding may be defined by the extent to which a particular action is either obstructing or taking me towards a goal which I want to achieve. So if the robots have a goal, then they can understand. This is the humble contention which I will put in. So if a robot is a sales representative trying to sell a brand to us, then he or she can understand our behavior.
Well, it depends on how we define. It depends on how we define understand, I guess. If it's successful in persuading and convincing you, we have the evidence that it has responded in an intelligent way. That's not the same as saying that it has understood us. It's like the Chinese room, once again. It's found an appropriate way to convince you to do something. And in that way, it's acting like a written message might do in trying to convince you. It's like advertising might do. Now, advertising doesn't understand you. It's simply words on a page or images on a screen that are delivered in a mass media sort of way. And I think if we think that understanding is really a question of just the ends rather than the means, that we're shortchanging what understanding really is. Or alternatively, we're thinking of human beings as behaving in a machine-like way, that we're looking at patterns of sounds and we're putting them together in a way that makes sense to give a certain sort of response to. And that's not really what we do. In understanding things, we rely on our past behavior, the image of the person, the nonverbal language that they're showing, any number of other things to truly understand and reflect back on what it might mean in light of our knowledge of humanity, our knowledge of culture, our knowledge of society, all of these things. And I think, that's the ideal that we might expect of an intelligent being to have. But I don't think we're anywhere near there. And in my estimation, we may never be there. We're getting closer and closer to being able to imitate that. But that's a matter of emphasizing the ends more than the means.
Yeah, but then then let me ask this question. Then how do you define if I take the ends part out of understanding, then how do you define understanding? Understanding what? How can we define?
Well, I guess it's the difference between if you give your students a multiple choice test and an essay test. In a multiple choice sort of test, they can match up the right answer with the question. And that's not that hard to do. Perhaps there are exercises in the back of the text that teach them how they might do that. And there are things that they can learn that will be appropriate responses, and they can remember that and judge. On the other hand, if it's an essay exam where you're asking them to show what they've learned and to extrapolate from that and to create something that responds to something that is not just something that has been said in a lecture or in the text, but shows their understanding of the material and their ability to use it and to apply it in a new context. That would be showing understanding. And so if we really want to measure student understanding, probably using something like an essay exam rather than a multiple choice exam would be a more appropriate thing to do. Depending upon the subject, of course. If it's mathematics, maybe not. Although in that case, we'd like them to show their work as well. How did you arrive at that answer? So in other words, what was your reasoning? What was your process of understanding, if you will, like?
This is, don't you think it is too much like Skinner's concept of generalization? So what you are saying that the generalization is the true meaning of understanding. So if I understand, I can generalize. So that is, in sum total, that is the basic hypothesis which you are proposing, Professor Belk. Like Skinner's.
Yeah, it doesn't have to necessarily be an observable sort of means.
Okay.
Or an end rather. If you are Indian and someone is speaking to you about a particular puja that they do, and you know it's the Durga puja, for example, and being Indian, you know something of what that is like and what it should mean, and you know that that's not like Diwali, that those are very different sorts of things, and so you can feel that. You may not even be able to articulate what the differences are, other than just talking about what each of them is, but you can feel that their behavior should not be the same in the puja as opposed to Diwali celebrations. And so it's relying on your cultural knowledge in that case, and the response is an internal feeling or understanding, if you will, rather than a particular verbal or nonverbal response.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor Belk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bell. So we have another interesting question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Anita, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
After that, I'll ask. Yeah, please go ahead.
Professor Belk, that was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. This is just a comment. In fact, I was watching this Netflix show called The Social Dilemma, which is just released. And I was just wondering if we are creating monsters and, getting close to those fearful sci-fi movies that we've seen. Because right now this pandemic is absolutely what Contagion was a few years ago. So by making the chatbots closer and closer to our needs, are we creating a monster when there'll be few people, as you rightly said, the last point in your slide, that machines are becoming more human and humans will become more machines, and maybe there'll be no longer humans and more machines around us. So do we see a world like that for future?
Well, I think it's something we shouldn't entirely dismiss. I think it's still a bit fanciful. Sherry Turkle, whom I mentioned, was being interviewed by a journalist once. She talks about this in one of her books. And she was asked by the journalist, what do you think about people who marry a robot to satisfy all of their physical and emotional needs for life? And she said, well, that's terrible. Robots can't feel. And the journalist accused her of being a bigot, of the same sort who didn't approve of gay and lesbian or interracial marriage. And so maybe in the future we will have rights of robots, as I was suggesting. And maybe they will be like a corporation, a non-human person. Corporations and nations can act as corporate beings, corporate people, corporate persons is actually the word in the legal terms, without being recognized as being humans. Now, whether we should be afraid of robots in the future, I think it's still a bit far-fetched. There are people like Ray Kurzweil who suggest that there's this point called the singularity, and that will be when computers are as intelligent as humans. And after that point, they will learn to reprogram themselves, and they will very quickly, exponentially increase in intelligence beyond our own. And if they have any need for us at all, it may be as pets or as zoo objects. And so under that scenario, we should be frightful of them in the future. There are a number of attempts to create artificial life in various ways, mechanically, biologically, transforming human beings as cyborgs, and the transhumanists. And transhuman is a term that suggests somewhere between human and post-human, there's this middle ground of being transhuman, and that's what they're interested in doing, creating their own lives to be extended and perhaps immortal. And if they don't achieve that during their lifetime, they go for cryonics and have their body or just their brain frozen so they can be revived at some point in the future. For these brave new worlds that they're imagining, maybe we do need to be concerned with a super intelligent race of beings, whether they're robots or humans, and the time to worry about that and go through scenarios of what would happen if is now rather than when it would be too late. So I don't think it's something that we should entirely dismiss, of that could never happen, that's just a fantasy. I do think it's rather far-fetched, and I think it's going to be at some very distant time in the future, but what would have to be achieved is something that I was just talking with Professor Krishna about, that we would have to sort of get over that hump where we would say this is just a machine that has no understanding, that it would actually have to have consciousness and to be able to be self-reflective and to understand its own behavior. That's something that I don't see happening anytime in the near future. And so, as I say, don't be worried, but be cautious in trying to run through these scenarios, even if they're only thought experiments at the present time, in order to imagine what would happen if, and what we could do to prepare. How can we make more empathetic robots, for example? One of the things that's being done right now is to make robots that can look at your face, can listen to the tone of your voice, can look at your hand gestures, and discern what emotions you're feeling. And in doing that, create appropriate emotional responses. There's what's called EQ rather than IQ. It's emotional quotient rather than intelligence quotient. And so that's one of the efforts that's being made, just one of many, to try to create kinder, gentler robots in the future. So a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Belk. In fact, this thought came from the entire discourse of sustainability, which is kind of become a monster at the moment because we didn't check that a long time back. So, you know, the question also came from there. But thank you so much for your response. Thank you.
Well, if I may, you mentioned COVID-19, and I'm giving a talk next week where I'm looking at some of the implications of COVID-19. And one of them may be, and this is actually Arundhati Roy in India had suggested, that anytime there's a crisis, it's an opportunity to move from one world to another. And as we've seen in the 1918 flu epidemic, in World War II, in the Black Plague, after 9/11 in the US, financial crisis in 2008, in each of these cases, there have been opportunities to introduce something really new. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank after World War II, for example. And so maybe seriously addressing climate change and seriously addressing income inequality and seriously addressing whether we need to have growth, exponential growth in the economy to succeed. maybe these are things that we can tackle at this juncture. I'm not overly optimistic, but I'm hopeful that maybe there's some possibility of really addressing some of the big issues rather than just the issues of the virus and its spread.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Belk. There is a follow-up question from our FPM representative, Saisha.
Yeah.
So, Saisha, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. So my question is that, the emphasis regarding the emphasis on, artificial intelligence and all that at this point of time, like, because I personally feel that there are a lot of conversations that we are having about AI and everything and how the world is becoming advanced and more modernized. But then aren't there other pressing concerns as well that need to be resolved? Now, a lot of people use AI as maybe tools to, the whole conversation is being shifted rather to AI rather than addressing a lot of other issues, which includes, as you said, prejudice, poverty, etc., etc. So if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, I think the agenda, well, actually, we've gone through phases. We've had what have been called AI winters, when funding sort of dries up because we don't seem to be making any progress, and AI springs, when it seems to be increasing because it looks like we're making great progress. We've just been enjoying an AI spring where the growth and enthusiasm for AI has been rising, but that's no guarantee that it's going to be rising in the future. Maybe we've reached one of those plateaus, not a dead end, but a plateau. And together with the COVID-19 crisis, I'm hopeful that maybe we can turn our attention. Black Lives Matter is another of those issues that has gathered a lot of steam recently. Protests about globalization, so-called anti-globalization, things like the Me Too movement. All of these are things that have gained a lot of momentum recently and tried to get us to pay attention to things that we hadn't considered very deeply most recently. And so I think maybe turning attention to climate, and climate is related to a number of these other issues, is something that will move us in those directions. Turning attention to rights of women, rights of minorities, rights of robots for that matter, may also be issues that we can address at this juncture. That anytime, Winston Churchill once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so here's a good crisis in front of us. What are we going to do with it? What sorts of benefits might we get? How can we how can we use lemons to make lemonade? How can we turn something bad into something that may also ultimately be beneficial? So I'm hopeful, yes, that these other issues that are quite important can gain some attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Belk. Thank you, Saisha. There's another follow-up question. Can AI help to improve understanding between the human beings? I think this is quite interesting to have a discussion on, because how it can improve the understanding. Could you please throw some light on that?
That's a difficult one. We're seeing AI develop better relationships with robots. We're seeing the therapy chatbots be able to help people develop better knowledge of themselves, to be able to pick themselves up, to be able to diagnose what's wrong with them. But at the same time, we are seeing a decrease in face-to-face human interaction. Social media, I remember a cartoon, and it was a funeral parlor in the West, and there was a casket in the front with the body, and there were chairs scattered around, but there were only 3 or 4 people in the chairs. And one of the people turns to the other one and said, I thought there'd be a bigger crowd. He had over 500 Facebook friends. Well, Facebook friends are not quite the same as face-to-face friends that we interact with on a daily basis. I don't know what you've experienced, but my experience of Zoom, it's not quite like being there. I would rather walk around the classroom. I would rather see people rather than just a tiny little thumbnail in the upper part of the screen. I'd rather see them in the whole, and I'd rather have them talk to each other rather than just talk to me, which is also difficult to do, although we can put you in chat rooms, which helps that a little bit. But there may be some things like that chat rooms where we actually do bring people together, even if we're bringing them together at a distance, that will make some progress in human understanding and being able to forge a solution out of different opinions that are expressed within that chat room. And maybe that is a human skill that can be transferred. But what Turkle is seeing so far in her book, Reclaiming Conversation, is that we're fearful of interacting with people, that these are tenuous and weak relationships that are bridging sometimes to different people, but they're not building the strong bonds that face-to-face conversations would have. And so I would rather see therapy to get people to interact better with each other done in person when it's possible, rather than online. But I think there are some things that we can do online that we would create that. You can imagine maybe a three-way therapy chat bot that Varsha doesn't get along with her mother. This is totally fictional, it's not true. And so we bring both Varsha and her mother and act sort of like a marriage counselor, trying to say, well, your mother said that. Is that what you're feeling, Varsha? Well, your daughter said this. Is that what you feel, Mom? And so there may be ways that we could intervene, and maybe rather than me being in the middle, it could be a chatbot that's in the middle, so that neither person feels they're letting their secrets out to someone else. And so maybe there are opportunities for something like that. I haven't seen that tried, but maybe that's something that someone will try in the future.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Bell. That was quite interesting. I can see a lot of questions, and people are very eager to ask you, but considering the time span, it would be a little challenging. So I would request all of you to just write the email to Professor Belk and maybe have a discussion.
Varsha, can I have one last question?
Yeah, please go ahead, Suresh. Professor Bell, can we take one more question?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, Suresh, go ahead.
Professor Belk, and it was absolute pleasure to be a part of this session. This paper, Servant, Friend, or Master, is a masterpiece, I would say, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading this paper multiple times. Well, I'm just completing one research project on voice assistants, and wherein we are using your paper also as a base paper. So I just want you to reflect on the work that we are doing. Is we're trying to say, okay, personification or humanization, or what you call as anthropomorphism is one dimension, but at the end we want to personify, or we want to humanize the voice assistants, so that marketeers can engage with the customers using voice assistants as a tool of engagement. But customers would only use if they derive some kind of consumption values out of it. So trying to see voice assistants from the lens of consumption values theory, wherein your extended self can become a social value or a social identity, and personification can be an emotional value. But we just want to, I just want to have your opinion. Is it a good idea to use consumption values as a lens to predict customer engagement, or rather the consumption of voice assistants by consumers?
Well, it sounds like you're using scaled responses of values, and that I am more used to doing qualitative research, so I may be looking at it in a different sort of way. But you're right that these exchanges should be two-way, that the customer should gain something from it as well, and that should be something that accords with their values, or who they are, or what they were trying to get out of the transaction in the first place. And so I would say go beyond values, but values may be a part of the sort of response, the sort of benefit that consumers are getting. I think that sounds like an appropriate starting point. And you can't do everything in one study, but I think that that sort of consumer engagement perspective, while it's not sort of research that I would do, is something that is quite valuable.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Professor Bell. Thank you, everybody, for your enthusiasm and the energy. Really commendable. I would now request Saisha to provide the thank you notes quickly, so that we can finish it on time.
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, Professor Bell, for this presentation. It was really wonderful, and the fact that all of us, I think, come from different disciplines, but your presentation could somehow speak to us, because it spoke at the level of language, which is common and universal to all. So I think that was really good for everybody over here, and everybody had to gain something or the other. And apart from this, of course, I would like to thank the FPM committee for hosting this entire event, and as well as the FPM, the MICA management. And thank you everybody for coming here. The FPM community is really keen to, it's been using your papers, we've been using your works, and yeah, it was altogether special to have you present live. And so thank you everyone for coming, for attending this session. And yeah,
Okay. Thank you so much, Sasha. Thank you so much, everyone, Professor Shroff, all the faculty members, FPM scholars, Professor Belk, of course. This was very insightful because, as Sasha mentioned, I would like to also say that, we use your work a lot in our sessions. So listening you live was really very insightful for all of us. Thank you so much, Professor Belk, for being with us.
And
Thank you, everyone.
a word of thanks to Varsha as well for bringing Professor Belk here. So thank you, Varsha.
Thank you so much, Suresh. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Have a great day ahead, everybody, and have a great evening, others, because we
Thank
are
you, ma'am.
in
Thank you
time
so.
zone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.